Like Troy, what is known of Homer is a mixture of history and myth. Although he's credited as the author of Western civilization's first works of literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey, very little evidence of Homer actually exists. Some scholars estimate he lived around 750 BC, and that he came from a place not far from Troy.
We think that he came from a region probably fairly close to Troy, perhaps from the city of Smyrna or from the island of Chios, but even this is doubtful. There's a strong tradition that he was blind, but other than that, virtually nothing can be said with any certainty about him.
How could someone who lived 500 years after the Trojan War recall such graphic details of battle and bloodshed? And how could one person, before the invention of Greek writing, remember more than 16,000 lines from the Iliad and 12,000 from the Odyssey? One possible answer is that Homer was a descendant of a lineage of singer-storytellers. If true, it means that the Iliad and Odyssey were not written by a Homer, but were passed down by many Homers.
It's perfectly plausible that singers immediately began to sing about this famous conflict, that it was passed on from one generation to the next, not with any attention to historical accuracy, in which no one had any interest. All the details and all the fancy stuff, and the woman running away, and Achilles and Hector, and the Trojan horse, all this stuff was generated by singers over the ages. Their contributions to the story were inherited by Homer, and he added his own twist to it.
But if Homer was the last in a lineage of oral poets, how did the story of Troy develop from a memorized song to the first written story in Western civilization? In the 1930s, an American scholar called Milman Parry equipped himself with some of the first portable sound recording devices and set off for Europe. Parry trekked to old Balkan villages in Serbia and discovered singers who, just like Homer, sang epic songs of ancient battles and heroes.
Parry made recordings on aluminum discs and on aluminum wire of these songs, and he also took down these songs by dictation. Parry discovered a very interesting thing, that when you write down an oral poem, it tends to get much longer than when you just sing it in a public performance.
For over a year, Parry investigated the oral tradition, transcribing and recording many songs, some as long as Homer's. He discovered that memories of historical events could be passed on for long periods of time and still remain accurate. The Serbian bards were still singing about the Battle of Kosovo, which took place in the 14th century. Written accounts confirm the veracity of these 600-year-old songs.
Is it plausible, therefore, that there really was a Trojan War, and that at least the fact of the war was passed down through oral tradition for 400 years or so until 800 BC, when Homer's poems were finally taken down? My own opinion is that this is plausible. There must, in fact, have been a Trojan War. Otherwise, why would anybody have sung about it in the first place?
Parry's work showed that one person couldn't only memorize songs as long as the Iliad and Odyssey, but that the accounts could be historically true. Explaining for the first time how the story of Troy could survive the 500 years until the time of Homer.
Homer must have been a very famous singer in his day. He must have been like the Rolling Stones. He was a very famous entertainer of some kind. It's plausible that his greatness as a poet, which is proven by the Iliad and the Odyssey, by his brilliant poems that have survived, did inspire somebody to record these stories. Indeed, the very man who invented the technological means that made the recording possible, that is, the Greek alphabet.
Before Homer, Oral tales were first memorized and then sung, usually at the feasts of aristocrats and noblemen. Homer's story of Troy was so powerful that a way to record the words so they could be taught to others needed to be found. But the Greeks had no system of writing until the gradual adaptation of the Phoenician script to include vowels eventually evolved into the Greek alphabet.
Here's an example based upon early epigraphic remains of what this text might have looked like. It begins on the right-hand side, back and forth, as the ox turns, the Greeks said, comparing this style of writing to the plowing of a field where you plow up one end and back the other and back again.
With Homer singing to a scribe, these heroic stories of Troy, the first in Greek history to be written down, inspired a much greater audience.
In my opinion, is because they were the first texts that ever existed in the Greek vocal alphabet. And as such, they were used from the very beginning as the basis for instruction about how to use this writing system. And they never stopped being that. So when you went to school in ancient Greece, you studied the text of Homer, right back to the day that the man who invented the alphabet first wrote them down.
Homer's story of Troy became the tool by which language and literature were taught, the very foundation of Western civilization. For the next 3,000 years, his story of Troy would inspire the greatest Greek and Roman writers, Renaissance artists, Shakespeare, and even Hollywood films. But over the centuries, the true story of Troy was blurred by myth, and Troy the city, a ruin even at the time of Homer, disappeared beneath the sands of time. Then, in the 19th century, inspired by Homer's account of battle, blood, lust, and deceit, a rich adventurer went in search of the treasures and the true story of Troy. It was a Bronze Age clash of culture, a battle over the most beautiful woman in the world. This tale of heroes, blood, lust, and deceit, from a time before writing, was sung for hundreds of years. Then the greatest of Greek singers, Homer, sang of Troy so powerfully he inspired the invention of the Greek alphabet. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were the first written works of ancient Greece and became the foundation of Western civilization. But over time, the story of Troy was obscured by legend and the city lost. Could Homer's Iliad and Odyssey lead explorers to the treasures of this legendary city and rediscover the true story of Troy? The 6th of July, 1827. After centuries of Ottoman occupation, Greece won its independence and emerged as a new nation. Europe was suddenly smitten with everything Greek, and Homer's Iliad and Odyssey ignited Trojan fever. With a pick in one hand and the Iliad in the other, a German self-made millionaire, Heinrich Schliemann, set off to uncover Troy.
Heinrich Schliemann is actually a fascinating man. He's a Wall Street tycoon of the 19th century. He made a great deal of money speculating in Russia and in the United States, including the gold rush in California. Having made a great deal of money and therefore being able to retire from his business pursuits, he at this point can go and pursue what he claimed was a lifelong fixation with Greece and particularly with the Trojan War.
Heinrich Schliemann had a knack for finding gold. He was in California for the gold rush, made a fortune in St. Petersburg under the Tsars, and in his search for profit and adventure, disguised himself as a Bedouin and made for Mecca. In 1868, he moved to Athens to search for the legends of Homer and ultimately Troy.
Schliemann was not an archaeologist, but he had a sacred faith in Homer. I mean, Homer was his Bible. And this led him to discover things which nobody else had thought of discovering, of looking for, let's say.
Schliemann set out to look for a place that matched the landscape described by Homer in the Iliad. A vast plain where two great armies could battle, near the Aegean Sea between the Scamander and Simois rivers. A place with high fortified walls, from where the Trojans could watch in horror as their champion Hector was dragged behind the chariot of Achilles around the city. Elizabeth Reardon, architect for the excavations, has retraced Schliemann's steps across the plains of modern Turkey.